And if folks have more questions, and I don't think, I'm not going to, a lot of what I'm going to talk about is actually a little bit, has some overlap with what Sarita was talking about. But just to give you a sense of the National Housing Law Project, like PolicyLink, we're a national policy organization. We focus on housing, obviously, and but specifically we focus on preservation of affordable housing, housing opportunities for everyone, particularly low and very low-income families. Historically, NHLP has been focused on things like areas like public housing and protecting tenants' rights in subsidized housing. We have branched out a little bit into fair housing, which is sort of my focus at NHLP, and we have likewise been involved sort of in the national efforts around the AFFH rule back since it was drafted in, the draft was issued in 2013, and have also been involved with assisting, providing technical assistance to advocates as well as jurisdictions across the country around the AFFH rule. I'm also going to talk today, so I'm going to talk about the assessment of fair housing. So if folks have more questions about that, feel free to chime in and ask those. But also, I'm going to talk about a bill that NHLP is co-sponsoring in the California legislature, AB 686, which is basically trying to put an AFFH obligation explicitly into state law. So we'll talk about that and really talk about some of the terms that right now are defined in the legislation and how you can get more involved if you'd like. An affirmatively furthering fair housing obligation into state law, into our state fair housing law. Great. All right, so, and what I wanted to talk about today was really focusing in a little, with a little bit more of a local flavor on the assessment of fair housing process, talk about what's going on right now, and also just talking about and you'll see, and I believe, I don't know if you have copies of these slides, I'm happy to share them with you, but just a projected schedule of when a lot of folks in this room, I think a lot of their jurisdictions might be coming due for the AFH, and just so you can start thinking about it in terms of your planning. As Sarita talked about, it's really important to start thinking about the assessment of fair housing early, particularly for those of you, a lot of you have access to data that, the HUD tool really just doesn't have. And so you really want to be able to, it's going to be very important to make sure that as your communities are engaging in this assessment of fair housing process, that information that you have access to, that you might have access to in your office, or that your colleagues might have access to, are making sure that that is available not only to your colleagues in a particular jurisdiction, but it's also part of this public process so that folks can, understand it. And a lot of you, I think, have a role in making that data accessible to the public, trying to explain, whatever information you might have and sharing that with a broader audience so that people can react to it. Because, a lot of what Sarita was talking about, the assessment of fair housing is about ultimately developing goals and strategies to really respond to these policies and practices, these contributing factors is what they're called in the assessment of fair housing that have led to these systemic inequities and disparities in access to opportunity. So I think just wanted to ground that in sort of what and I would love to hear as well what folks are thinking about in terms of the assessment of fair housing. I don't know how many of you had heard about it before today or started talking about it with your jurisdictions.
Only from a presentation.
Only from
I did before.
Great.
Oh, okay. That I was on.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, no, this is a really, really great opportunity, and and as sorry, I have my actual slides flipped ahead of myself, so I keep looking at this, and I'm like, no, I don't want to talk about that yet. But anyway, so the assessment of fair housing process, so Where it's going on right now in the Bay Area is San Mateo County. So San Mateo County is doing a joint assessment with, I believe, total there will be 7 entities. So you have the city, as well as the county of San Mateo, Redwood City, Daly City, South City, as well as 2 housing authorities, so the County Housing Authority, as well as South San Francisco's Housing Authority. Is anyone here or on the line from San Mateo County? I didn't hear any on the phone.
There were a few.
Yeah. Oh, great.
Yeah.
So that this process is ongoing. NHLP has been working with local housing and other advocates, tenants' rights and other advocates, to begin this whole process of getting involved in the community participation piece, which is really where San Mateo County is really right now, is they're having stakeholder meetings. They're about to, or in the process of, rolling out a survey that's going to go out to community members. They're also setting up their community participation process where you are going to have focus groups and other sorts of opportunities for public engagement. So that process is ongoing. So for those of you who have an assessment of fair housing coming up, a lot of you it will be in October of 2019, it looks like, at least based on the information we have right now. So definitely think about reaching out to San Mateo County, as this process unfolds and when it's concluded, and just sort of get a better understanding, from a government perspective, for those of you who work in government, and I think that's a lot of you, how this process goes and some lessons learned. But I think it's a really great thing that there is this really big assessment going on right now in the Bay Area, and it's obviously San Mateo County is dealing with a lot of issues that Will and Sarita have talked about today, and others in the room. Obviously the Bay Area is experiencing an affordable housing crisis, particularly for communities of color and other protected classes under the Fair Housing Act. There's a lot of discussions around displacement and gentrification, and particularly in San Mateo County with the presence of Silicon Valley, and just a lot of displacement for a lot of the longtime residents who are living there, are creating real fair housing issues. And so I think, when you're doing this assessment and you're thinking about, not only just, what we think of as discrimination, but as Sarita said, the AFSH rule and in this process is really getting us to look at policies and practices, so things like the existence or absence of tenant protections, the existence or absence of protections based on source of income, so folks can use their Section 8 vouchers to be able to actually secure housing. Just really thinking about these policies and practices, criminal history, admissions, policies and practices in housing, all of these different, policies and practices that exist in the housing context, zoning obviously as well, that, are not explicitly discriminatory, but obviously have discriminatory effects against a range of protected classes, like criminal history, for example, not only racial and ethnic minorities, but persons who experience disabilities are also, disparately impacted by those policies. Also going on in Southern California is the Los Angeles Assessment of Fair Housing. So it's a much bigger one, just in terms of number of people. It's the county, it's the city, as well as the housing authorities of the county and city. So that's also ongoing right now. They are at a similar point in the process. They are gathering information from the public. They are doing, stakeholder meetings and also have a survey out, and I believe a stakeholder survey out as well. So again, these are just 2 processes to watch. I don't know, Sarita, if you have anything to add about LA. Are you guys working in LA?
No,
okay.
We're not.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
No, I think the only thing I would add is that LA is a great example of what's possible, because nobody thought that the city and the county would partner together, right? It's unheard of, right? It's not going to happen. They're not going to do it. They're not going to do it. So it can be done. and to have the PHAs on board as well, right? So now all of this assessment can happen together, and the resources can be layered and leveraged across each other. So push for that kind of approach wherever you can.
And just really quickly, and particularly for those of you who have relationships with your housing authorities, so housing authorities in particular have not really done this sort of planning before. Most of them, have never done an analysis of impediments. And so for them, this sort of assessment of fair housing process, they do their PHA plans. They have, their administrative and, admissions and continuous occupancy policies, so they have their planning documents, but something like this where they're thinking more broadly about, issues of equity in fair housing, it is important for, whether they are collaborating or not for the jurisdiction to provide housing authorities with that support, because I think this is a new process for them. And did you have a question?
Yeah, just before you move on, I'm wondering if Belen or Heather from San Mateo want to just say quickly kind of how you are engaging in the process. You guys there?
I'm sorry, Will, this is Edith. It was hard to hear. What were you requesting? So this is Belen.
I was wondering how you all are engaging in the process in your county.
Yeah. So Heather is having some issues with the phone. Are you trying to unmute yourself? So, yeah, you're not. We cannot hear you. Oh, okay. So do you want to come here? So this is Belen from the public health system here in San Mateo County. And Edith, are you with environmental health?
No.
We have one more person from San Mateo. So the health system, we were contacted by the Department of Housing, who is leading this effort in the county of San Mateo. One, to provide data. So in addition to the information and data that had provided, DOH reached out to us to see what additional information we can provide as far as the opportunity indexes that has requires, as well as any additional information that is related to fair housing. So that's our most direct way, the most direct way that we are collaborating with the process. But we also are working, participating as a stakeholder. So they just had the first community meeting with a wide range of stakeholders, and the county DOH is planning to have 3 focus groups, the Latino with Filipinos and people with disabilities, as well as 2 community-wide meetings, and we are hoping to partner with some of the outreach to these different meetings. The DOH, after the community stakeholder meeting, reached out to all participants to see how they can provide any assistance in outreaching. So they are letting community partners co-host these meetings along with the consultants that they hire to make sure that they are reaching out to the populations, the most vulnerable populations. So that's the way we are collaborating. I think there's a lot of questions around the data that had provided and how it can be, what is the story that this information is telling about the county, and given that the data is a little bit older, how can we make sure that it's a little bit more updated, so the story is up to date, if we can say that. So at this point we are going to be helping them with their research more than anything else.
Great. Thank you. And that's actually an excellent segue. So thank you. We did not pre-plan this. So again, not to belabor the point, but on the first bullet, these are the main sort of fair housing issues is what the assessment calls them that really frame the assessment of fair housing. So you have segregation and integration. We talked about racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty. The two that I wanted to focus on, because I think it would be of particular interest to this group, disparities in access to opportunity. So HUD provides, and the person from San Mateo County kind of touched on this, HUD provides sort of these opportunity indices. So in a variety of areas, education, the environment, labor, / employment access, transit access, as well as exposure to low poverty is sort of the way the index is framed, but essentially exposure to poverty. And so in the environmental index, the environmental health index, because since you all focus on health issues, one area where it's definitely important for you all to get involved is that index, and it is just a number from 0 to 100. That index really measures air toxins because that's really the consistent sort of national data that HUD was able to get from the EPA. So as you can imagine, environmental, access to environmental opportunity and access to a healthy environment goes beyond, sort of what toxins are in the air. And so I just wanted to sort of read some of the other things that when HUD is discussing, and without getting too much into the weeds about the way that the document works, where HUD is discussing when it's talking about like the location of environmental health hazards, which is sort of one of the quote-unquote contributing factors that you're going to look at. It touches on safe and clean drinking water, soil contamination, indoor health hazards. So somebody mentioned, I think it was Will, lead-based paint, right? The presence of lead-based paint, asbestos. Also it talks about obesity. It talks about, industrial siting policies. And so all of these things, are sort of mentioned in this overall definition of environmental health hazards, but the data point that is provided by HUD only gets at one sliver of that. So to the extent that you have locally available information, that's going to be critical to making sure that this document really fully reflects the reality on the ground. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, that was like a 5.
Oh, 5. Oh, okay. Not a high five.
No. We can do that later.
No high five. All right. I live for high five. Anyway, and then the other that I thought would be of particular interest is this other fair housing issue. And in the assessment, the way that it's broken down, there are specific questions and instructions that are related to each of these questions. HUD kind of tells you, okay, here are the maps that we have that relate to these particular areas. But you should also add any other information, any locally available data or information that you have access to that would help sort of flush this out a little bit more and make this analysis more robust. So the other thing is disproportionate housing needs, which deals specifically with two things: cost burden. So how severe is your housing burden? Are you paying more than 30 or 50% of your income on housing costs? As well as habitability issues. So things like incomplete kitchen or plumbing, as well as overcrowding. And I think Will mentioned earlier this morning about the health effects, right, that come about from overcrowding as well as substandard living conditions. So that's another piece of the analysis. Again, HUD is kind of going off of the data that they have, and I believe data from the census. That's not going to fully capture, what's happening in your community. So just another plug for, how important it is for you all to get involved and make sure that this is a robust document. I will move quickly. So Sarita also had a version of this, but this is just, again, definitely go play with the data and mapping tool. Again, a dot density map, and the shading here corresponds, as you see on the legend, with the index score in the environmental health index, with the darker, closer to 100, meaning sort of a healthier environment, a higher access to environmental health or environmental healthy neighborhood. So the lighter shades are either there's no data available or they rank very low. So if you see really sort of white pockets, that's definitely flagging a place that you need to investigate further. All right, so please take this with a huge grain of salt. This is based on the information that we have. Depending on the extent to which jurisdiction there are a lot of different factors that I won't go into here because I'll put you all to sleep about what can actually change the due date for an assessment of fair housing. But this is currently, as it stands, what the projected due dates are. And I didn't even cover sort of, Napa County is not on here, but I believe it also shares in October. I didn't know how far out to go in terms of Bay Area, but there's a good thing.
That would be really helpful.
Yeah. And if you want, feel free to contact me. We could talk more. So sorry. Didn't mean to leave anybody out, but this is just a sort of snapshot. And as you can see, there are a ton of jurisdictions that are due on this particular date in late 2019. So this is something to think about, like Sarita was talking about, in terms of collaborating. And yes, there's a link down there. But I put a bunch of disclaimers because depending on what happens with jurisdictions and how they decide to match up, it could change.
Excuse me. Hey, I'm on the line. I have a quick question.
Yes.
Yeah, I was just wondering if we are not able to find information about what the date's going to be, or if the process is already underway in our area. Like, what would be the local sort of touch point to be able to get access to like the timeline and where things are at? Because 2019, it seems like that's pretty close. So if we're not hearing things in the community, I just wonder where we can get that information. Thank you.
So generally, there are a couple things you can do. So generally, your housing community development office, those are the folks that are generally going to be running the process. So they have an idea, of what they're thinking about and, when this process is going to unfold. You can also contact me, and I can put you in contact with folks at HUD. Region 9 is in the San Francisco office. They're the folks that sort of oversee this process, and because they have to tell HUD when they're going to submit the document, HUD, in 2019 might be a little bit far out for places to be making these decisions quite yet, but HUD would have an idea if they've made any requests to change. So my contact information is at the end. Feel free to reach out to me independently, or you can ask Will, and he can connect us. I'm happy to talk through that with you a little bit more. So just really quickly, so that we can get to the bill. So Sarita kind of teed this up and talked about sort of the threats that we're seeing at the federal level with respect to affirmatively furthering fair housing, the rule, the HUD regulation that came out in 2015. And so advocates in California were, kind of seeing the national trend, sort of broader assaults on, civil rights generally, and just this sort of environment that, unfortunately, that we found ourselves in nationally. And folks thought it would be a good time to, sort of take a look at what we're doing in California. And so, we do have, as I believe Sarita mentioned, the California Fair Employment and Housing Act, which is the state sort of version of the Fair Housing Act. It does cover a broader number of protected classes, as Sarita mentioned, but it doesn't actually include an explicit affirmatively furthering fair housing obligation. So what AB 686 would do was it would amend FEHA to say that public agencies, which includes a wide range of different entities, but it includes things like counties, cities, and public housing authorities, would have to administer their programs and activities related to housing and community development in a way that affirmatively furthers fair housing. And it also defines a few sort of key terms related to fair housing. So I'll just talk about affirmatively furthering fair housing, what that actually means. And so what it would mean is, and it's taking some of the language from the rule, meaningful actions in addition to combating discrimination. So that's sort of what we talked about. It's not enough to not just discriminate, but also taking meaningful actions that overcome patterns of segregation, address disparities in housing needs and access to opportunity, promote fair housing choice, and foster inclusive communities free from barriers that restrict access to opportunity. I know it's a mouthful. Based on characteristics that are protected by FEHA, and that also transform racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity. as well as protecting existing residents from displacement. So I know there's a lot packed in there, but the idea is to really reflect the fact that California, has a commitment to fair housing, has a commitment to equity and fair housing choice, and that jurisdictions, would have to think about these things, and when they're administering their housing and community development programs, they would have to do so in a way that begins to tackle these longstanding issues of segregation and discrimination as well. I know I'm probably way over time, but do folks have questions about that? I know I kind of talked a lot quickly at the end, but and if folks feel free, my contact information is at the end of the slide. So please support AB 686, I should say, if you can. And there's more information at that link. Willard, is this going out to the folks?
We can send it out.
Yeah, feel free to send it out to the folks. And there's a link to the bill tax, which was recently updated, and more information and how you can get involved and support this really important legislation. And I'm happy to talk to folks after, but I don't want to hold anybody up anymore. So, any questions? All right. Thank you.